Welcome back, everyone. We're rounding the corner to the end of this whole certificate program, so it's pretty exciting to see everything come together. I'm going to go through some usual administrative updates just to give you guys some heads up on some things, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome back, folks. Assignment feedbacks. Majority, if not all, of the written assignments should have been sent out in terms of feedback and grading scales. The elevator pitch, the final one, those will also be sent back soon. We'll be notifying the finalists by the end of this week, so you'll have some time to be able to plan out your day so that you can have your one-on-one with our special presenter, Bree McWhorter. In terms of Module 8 assignment, today's sort of reminder, next week, I know the turnaround is a little bit tight, is to be able to finish out your final submission for your writing piece, taking on the feedback that was provided, and that's due next week. If you need a couple more days, we should be able to grant that, but we're trying to make sure you get your feedback on time. And if you're not as enthusiastic for the competition, the written competition, you can take a couple more days to be able to evaluate and write. So that way you can still get feedback, but you most likely will not be considered for the written competition aspects. Just depends on timing of when you get that in. So just a heads up there. So I'm excited to be able to get us started in our discussion and chat today by introducing our moderator. So our moderator today, Chia Chun or Angela, is a PhD candidate at UCI in the Earth System Science Department. Outside of her PhD program, she is the Science and Technology Advisor at Open Dialogues International Foundation. She is a co-founder of the Science Policy and Advocacy Network at UC Irvine, which is a chapter of the National Science Policy Network, and has served as its past president. She's also on the Western Onboarding Chair of the National Science Policy Network. She's a co-coordinator, she's been a past participant, and I'm so incredibly grateful to call her a friend. I think she's one of the most excellent individuals to be moderating today because she is interested in going into science policy and taking a step towards these fellowships. I think that she's an excellent fit for this. So I will pass this to Angela.
Thank you, Joanne. Hello, everyone. Yes, it's the slide. Before we start introducing our panelists, I want to give a reason and expecting outcomes that we're having another panel today. So we know that there are many career options and niches in the science policy. Today, we will continue to provide insights from experts on what a science policy career could look like. Also, some of the panelists we have today have transitioned from science policy to private sector, so we'll hear that too. Just a little bit comparison between this panels and previous panels. Sorry if you hear some noise, that's my cat from the background. So the speakers last time, they have transitioned successfully to their science policy positions for a while. Today, we are focusing on individuals who transitioned already or recently transitioned to a science policy career, or they transitioned to science policy and then to other sectors. And most important, is all of them, they have been awarded a science policy fellowship before they started their science policy career. So we will focus on two science policy fellowship today. One is the federal level fellowship, which is AAAS fellowship, and the other one is a state level fellowship at CCST from California. So before I hand this to our panelists to present their slide, I'm going to introduce our panelists. So let's start with from the left, it's Sam Manhans. So he completed his PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology at UC Irvine last year. And he's currently wrapping up his Science and Technology Policy Fellowship with the California Council on Science and Technology, that is CCST Fellowship. He was actually a past president he is past participant of our certificate class. We are in the same cohort from 2020, actually. And then after that, we co-founded the UCI Science Policy chapter under National Science Policy Network. He was also an associate editor at the Journal of Science Policy and Governance since 2020, which is a great science policy journal that Adriana is the CEO right now. And today we'll hear about Dr. Manhattan's his most recent experience as a fellow and what he sees on the horizon. I'm going to pass it to Sam first, and I'll introduce the other two panelists later. Would that be okay, Joanne? So, Sam, do you have the slides?
I do, and thank you for the introduction. I am really overjoyed to be able to come back to this program, which was really wonderful for me. I took the program in 2020, and in a year when not much went right anywhere, this was a really important thing for me to kind of, I think, keep me on a good career track. So let me share my screen, which hopefully goes smoothly. Okay, so going from science to policy. CCST is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization established in 1988 by the California State Legislature. It was designed to advise the state on policy questions relating to science and technology. And my apologies if there's still background noise. I'm in a full working legislative office, so it's always a risk. But CCST, I think, is probably best known in the Capitol and nationally for its science policy fellows, but also does a lot of reports on different scientific issues, often at the behest of the legislature, where if they're interested in, say, the impacts of wildfire and really want a deep scientific perspective on that, they will ask CCST to kind of write up a report of the state of the art of the science on that. So CCST does this by partnering with a variety of institutions. This is where they get a lot of their expertise. So using the wildfire example, if they're interested in kind of the scientific impacts of wildfire, they might bring in people from Stanford or Caltech or some of these national labs to give them the state of the current science on wildfire impacts. But like I said, it's mostly known for its science policy fellowship. So this actually on the right is my class, which still feels a little surreal to say. But the policy fellowship places PhD scientists, engineers, and social scientists in the California state government. And we work directly on policy, whether we're placed in agencies or directly in the legislature. We are all day to day working on different bills and different regulations that, if they come out and get signed by the governor, or if the regulation goes all the way through, will change the regulatory environment in California. So the fellowship program has been going on for 14 years and has trained over 154 PhD scientists in policy. Now, the reason I really want to kind of emphasize this is because this alumni network is incredibly helpful. I know to Sacramento, I'm not knowing anyone, and so many of my friends are former fellows who've been incredible in terms of career advice, in terms of making connections, in terms of just forwarding me job postings. The alumni network for CCST is very strong, both within Sacramento and nationally. Like there were a couple of recent meetups in DC and Seattle, one, I believe, associated with the AAAS conference. And so there's both a good presence still in California, but also other parts of the country. So applications for the next class will be open December 1st, 2023. I don't think we have final dates on some of the like the interview schedule for next year yet, but the fellowship will begin November 1st, 2024, which sounds like a very far off date, but I this will approach pretty soon. And one thing that's, I think, important to know about CCST is that you don't necessarily need to already have your PhD when you're applying. You just need to have it by September 15th of the year you'll be starting. So when I applied, I was just about to start finishing up my PhD and was able to use the fellowship as kind of a something where I need to finish up this summer. I need to get out. I have something lined up, and obviously very helpful for scheduling, because finishing up grad school can be a little tough to get the timelines together. So the alumni are pretty well represented in California state government, but also in nonprofits and research or other government, including the federal and other state governments, as well as private industry and a couple other fields. So why would you want to become a CCST fellow? The perks are learning about the California government and decision-making process firsthand, use your analytical and scientific training to advise decision makers. I will say so many things that I learned in grad school and before really do come up in terms of looking at very complex legislation. It almost feels like designing an experiment or reading a complex scientific paper. You can also gain professional skills, and there's a lot of leadership training that's been really, really helpful this year. So you get direct experience. Each CCST fellow is placed in either state legislative office, state agencies, or the office of the governor. Everybody works on slightly different stuff, but everybody works in very much a hands-on fashion and is kind of in the room. I try not to say the Hamilton quote where it's like in the room where it happens, but sometimes it does feel like, why am I in this meeting? This seems very high level, but usually in a very exciting way. So fellows work as a full-time staff member in their placement office for a full year. There's a lot of professional development that goes on during the year, kind of aside from your day job. So there's a month-long intensive orientation and training at the beginning that we usually call policy boot camp. And then that kind of continues throughout the year in the form of professional development seminars and workshops. I don't know if this will be the schedule next year, but we have them on Friday afternoons this year. And it's a great way to both check in with the other fellows in my class and kind of keep the professional development rolling throughout the year. And you also get a lot of mentorship from a lot of the alumni. My boss is an alumni program, and I also have another alumni mentor who also served on this committee. And they've been incredibly helpful for really helping me get up to speed on energy policy and just constantly on legislature works. So a little bit more on policy boot camp. You learn about the legislative process in California. Some of those aspects are very close to the federal policy landscape that I was a little bit more familiar with, but some are a little bit different. So that's very, very helpful, especially if you're moving from out of state or having interacted with California government much. You learn about policy committees and kind of what goes on within a committee hearing. You learn how a bill becomes a law and when science meets policy, how the two interact. And also you learn kind of how different processes within the government work. So how to ask people for informational coffee meetings, how to conduct a hearing, say. So the application timeline and eligibility, these are essentially preliminary deadlines, but we've pulled from this year. This information may change, so please check in with the website before taking my word for any of the deadlines currently presented. But I just want to reiterate that you can apply before finishing grad school and just need to have proof of your PhD being conferred before September 15th. So for reference, I applied, I believe I sent my application in last January, and then ended up finishing up my dissertation in August, and then taking a little bit of time off, and then starting the program in November. As far as eligibility, for residency, U.S. citizens or suitable immigration status for non-residents is required. Please feel free to reach out to the CCST program staff for more detailed information on that. That's not something that I personally agree with, so I don't feel fully equipped to speak to it. But I will say the program staff are excellent at answering questions. So feel free, if you have any questions about that, to reach out. If you're interested in learning more, we host alumni webinars where you can learn directly from people who have been through the program. And I believe some of them are posted to an existing YouTube channel. And this is a personal plug because I've just gone through this process with all these people, but you can learn from the fellowship blogs. So the one on the right from Polymers to Policy was recently posted by Sophia Chan, who's a member of my cohort. And so we've all tried to make these blog posts to describe kind of what we've experienced this year, maybe what we've learned, and some of our takeaway lessons. So I encourage you to read some of those if you're interested in kind of maybe what some fellow day-to-day experiences like. And also alumni profiles. If you're interested in seeing, if I do this fellowship, where might I end up in 5 or 10 years afterwards? Like, where do these people usually go? So they do try to kind of keep track of the alums. We tend to stay pretty tight. And so if you're curious about that, there should be a healthy number of alumni profiles on the website. But a little bit more about me. So before finishing grad school, I was a scientist studying marine biology. Here is me in Alaska taking copious notes on tide pools and tide pool seaweeds. And in a very, very short time, I was analyzing legislation for the California Assembly Committee on Utilities and Energy. I came in with no background at all in energy policy, and the learning curve was pretty wild, but also incredibly exciting. And I can confidently say that I've learned more this year than any single year when I was in grad school, and had more fun. My committee duties included analyzing bills. So you write up what we call bill analysis, which kind of provides some historical context for a bill, walks the reader through what the bill would actually do if implemented. And these are really important because if you've ever looked at bill language, it's written in whereas, thou shalt, like very legalistic language that can often be very, very unclear. And so just reading a bill, it can be really difficult to understand what it would actually do. And that's where kind of the committee's job comes in, is to explain, if we pass this, what would actually happen. Sometimes as a committee member, you negotiate amendments on bills to try to improve the legislation as it goes through the process. But I've also gotten the chance to staff a committee bill. So we were running largely a code cleanup bill, and I got to kind of shepherd that through multiple committees during the legislative process, which is a really fun experience to kind of see the bill process from that side. And I also got to organize an informational hearing. This was last week, actually. It was on electric vehicle charging infrastructure. In California, we're trying to deploy electric vehicles to decarbonize transportation, which is a large source of greenhouse gases in the state. So we got a bunch of panelists together from government agencies and the private sector to kind of speak to some of the challenges in achieving our zero emission vehicle goals. So that was a really fun experience. This was presented to me as one of the big perks of being on or being in energy policy is you get to take a lot of fun field trips. So on the left, we were touring the Port of Oakland to see some of the stuff that they're doing to reduce emissions at the port. They're electrifying a lot of their trucking and a lot of their equipment to reduce the environmental impact on kind of the local environment in the Bay Area and also on nearby communities. And on the right, it's pretty recent, but we toured the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, which is the last nuclear facility operating in California. And honestly, the scale of that was pretty mind-boggling. So you're not just stuck in an office all day. You definitely get to take field trips. And I think it's important to kind of see on the ground where the policy is actually having an effect and not get too stuck inside of the know. So the issues I covered this year were electric vehicles, as I mentioned, also offshore wind energy development, which has been really, really exciting to work on. And then also kind of a potpourri of other issues. So a little bit of hydrogen development, a little bit of energy storage and batteries, a little bit of solar insulation, energy efficiency in buildings, and a couple more. And I like to throw this in because this is the Utilities and Energy Committee, and railroads are treated as utilities. So I randomly got a bill about railroad safety. And one of the fun parts of the legislature is sometimes you're just like, oh, I guess I work on railroads today. And it's, you kind of got to be ready for anything, but it's also really, really fun. And sometimes you just get the chance to learn about a new subject in a way that I really, really enjoy. So just to expand it out, my cohort is 14 science fellows who have covered everything from energy to environmental policy, toxic material safety and disposal, transportation, housing. We have a fellow at the Department of Insurance, a fellow working on water policy, and more. And a couple of pictures to the right, we all got along. We've hung out a lot this year, and don't mean to overshare, but one of my great paranoias coming out of grad school was I was going to be the only new person at some company and new kid on the block. Everybody's already made their friends. And so it was really, really nice to come in a cohort of 14, and a lot of us were moving from elsewhere. We became really tight because we all just kind of got thrown into this crazy world together. And so it was honestly really, really nice going through this experience with these people. So that's the CCST Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. Please feel free to visit the website for more details and check up as soon as they post the actual deadlines for the application for this year. And I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you, Sam. I saw two or three questions in the chat. I think we can address that later when we put participants in the breakout room. But I believe, for example, William, do the engineers need to be a PhD as well? I believe that you can find it on the website for the answers. Joanne, did you mind pulling up the panelist slide again? So before we transition to the AAAS fellowship, I want to introduce the other two panelists. The first is Justin Smith, PhD. He is a principal data scientist at the Blue Shield of California. So Dr. Smith completed his PhD in condensed matter physics in 2017 and completed his AAAS STPF fellowship in 2019. STPF stands for Scientist and Technology Policy Fellowship. So he will be able to provide a perspective of his time as a fellow and how he leveraged those skill sets into his current role. And I don't know, Justin and Sam, you know each other or not, but Sam is a co-founder for our science policy group at UC Irvine that is registered under NSPN. But Justin, you are the co-founder or the founder of the first science policy group at UC Irvine. So it's a kind of like a reunion for UCI alumni today. Our third panelist, Elizabeth O'Hare, PhD. She is a senior principal at Lewisburg Associate LLC. So Dr. O'Hare leads Lewisburg biomedical research activities, advises clients in the areas of federal research policy and healthcare, with a focus on NIH and agencies that determine grant-making policy, including the Office of Management and Budget and the Department of Health and Human Service. So in 2010, Dr. O'Hare was a AAAS Congressional Science Policy Fellow. So today she will be providing how the fellowship impacted her career, what she does on a day-to-day, and her recommendation for future science policy leaders and advocates. So Justin and Elizabeth, they are both AAAS awardees. I'm going to turn the microphone to you, Justin and Libby, to introduce AAAS Fellowship.
So I am presenting on behalf of Iris Wagstaff, who originally was supposed to present this, but I'm going to be butchering everything about AAAS just to touch on the high levels. And
we can chime in as necessary.
Yes. So I'll be leaning on Justin and Libby to help me through this, but I just really wanted to sort of highlight the primary aspects of AAAS, the American Association for Advancements of Science. They have a lot of different types of programming that you may be interested in, including some of the lists here. They also manage some of the very big journals, if you've heard about them, Science Advances, Science Immunology, just to list a few. But some other aspects that I know is really interesting for some folks here: advocacy for evidence, careers in STEM. I know there's a lot of interest in science diplomacy and science education. So just FYI, this is sort of the foundation of the group. And this group has been around for a very long time, established back in 1848, I believe. So just as a sort of a foundation, I cannot say that I could go in depth about each of the fellowships that they have, but the ones that I wanted to highlight that are already available, and then we'll go into sort of the details of them and the personal experiences of Justin and Libby, one of which is what we've heard, which is the Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, which STPF is the acronym which you'll hear often. I highlighted a couple of things that are most important here, which is for your personal professional development, you are able to actually make contributions to a federal level of policy making while you're sort of bridging that gap between science and policy. The applications are open now and they're closed on November 1st. You'll get wind of sort of whether you'll be moving on to the interviews. Expect that you'll be actually doing a one-pager briefing memo a one-page briefing memo to sort of see and test your skills and your ability. And then the fellowship actually runs for a year, and you'll have orientation to set you up. There will be more information readily available, and I can drop that link into the chat for you all if you wanted to take a look.
And a really important interjection here, and I think Sam was kind of referencing this, in CCST, you don't need your PhD yet when you apply. In AAAS, you do need your PhD at time of application, unless that's changed in the past few years, but I don't think it has. So that is a quirk to the application process.
Excellent detail, Justin. This is why you're here. Anything that you wanted to add, Libby, in terms of just logistics? If not, I can move on to the second one.
No.
Excellent. And then the second one that I saw that was readily available is their Mass Media Science and Engineering Fellowship. It's a 10-week summer course, sort of a replacement of this type of work, but much more in depth. Again, highlighting the key aspects that you'll be getting out of that type of fellowship. You actually get to put together the research and write and do actual reports on headlines. And that's a true sort of cross-functional aspect of that program, which helps you have portfolio material on taking really complex science information and making it readily available for the public. Again, this is a 10-week summer program. The application window has opened. It'll be closed. Sorry, the application window will open on October 1st. It'll close around January 1st, and you'll get notification as to whether or not you are part of the program or not by the time summer rolls around next year. So just, again, some dates and some information there. A lot more on the back end for the logistics. I don't believe Justin or Libby had participated in this, but just wanted to highlight that for you all. Thank you, Angela, for dropping that in the chat. Again, I'm here to butcher AAAS. They had to do so much more, and there is so much to be able to explore on their website. So please take a look at that, and I'll stop sharing. And I want to pass to Justin and Libby. We'll start with Justin first. Can you share a little bit about what compelled you to apply for the STPF fellowship? And sort of what you really took out of that program, and then we'll pass it to Libby after.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, what compelled me was a few different things. I mean, kind of my story is that, in the middle of my PhD, I had that crisis of, do I want to be doing research? What do I want in my future? One point, of course, I was like, oh, I want to be a professor. And, that got beaten out of me in my first year. So I was directionless, and I, just turned to Google and typed in, what can you do of a science PhD? And, many things popped up on the list. Of course, it said like, oh, you can become a professor. It's like, okay, I don't need to know that, Google. But down like all the way at the bottom, it's like, you could do science policy. I was like, okay, what is science policy? I've never heard those two words together before. So I dug into a little bit, learned about AAAS, and got really lucky in that AAAS has its annual meeting every February. And I was doing this Google search in January, and that annual meeting was in San Jose, and I was living in Irvine doing my PhD. So I just registered last minute and, drove up to San Jose and crashed on a friend's couch and just tried to absorb as much as I could at that conference. And there is where I really learned about the policy fellowship. And it just became this kind of pivotal moment where it's like, okay, this is the thing I want to do, because I get to, take my PhD and to me feel like I'm doing useful things with it, which is what had initially driven me into science in the first place. Like, I had this dream of like impacting the world with my work. Turned out I became a theoretical physicist, and you don't really impact much that way. So science policy was the much better way to actually do that with my training. So, kind of from that moment on, I decided, like, I'm going to do everything I can to land this fellowship when I'm done with grad school. We can kind of delve into those a bit later in the Q&A, but, essentially just tried to get as many relevant experiences as possible and really create like a compelling case to AAAS that, like, I am actually invested in this and this is what I actually want to do, as opposed to just kind of panic applying and going into this. So all that to say is, I wanted to make actual impact with my PhD. AAAS was the way to do it. Yeah, was there a second part to that question, Joanne?
No, you
No?
answered it well.
Okay, great. Go for Libby.
Sure. So yes, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. So I'm joining you live from the East Coast. So I actually have some similarities to Justin, but let me see if I can provide some context. So I did my graduate work at UCLA, and I got my PhD. I completed my PhD in 2008. And so I, like Justin, was sort of about halfway through my PhD program or PhD coursework and started to think about really what was my career trajectory. What did that look like? And probably like many of you, I've been passionate about science since I was a very tiny human. And I kind of kept my head down and kept working towards that PhD. That was the goal, that was the goal, that was the goal. And then all of a sudden, I'm sort of 2 years into a PhD program and I start to think, wait a second, do I really want to be, an academic researcher? Do I want to be research faculty? What does that look like? And so I went through a period of doing a lot of intensive self-reflection. I certainly, like Justin, was also, using the tools available to me to explore different career pathways. And I started to think about the things that I liked about science, always more thinking big picture, writing grants, giving presentations, thinking about the role of science in society. And then the things that I didn't really like about research. The thing I remember the most clearly all these years later is writing code. And there's even more code writing now than there was 15 years ago when I was in grad school. So I think I made the right choice in that regard. So I started through this process. I began to learn about different opportunities, and actually very similar to Justin, learned about the AAAS fellowship program actually at the Society for Neuroscience annual conference, which was my professional society at the time. And I said, oh, look at this. I live in Los Angeles and it's in San Francisco, and I can stay with friends. And so I floated my own costs to go to the AAAS annual meeting and stayed with friends. And that's really where I realized, okay, this is the path for me. This is what I want to do. And I did actually do a postdoc. So I decided that I would do a postdoc to kind of keep my options open. And I did that. I was at UC Berkeley, which actually worked out well because I wasn't ready to leave California yet. I'm from the East Coast originally. And so it was during that I applied for the AAAS fellowship in the fall of 2009. And to Sam's earlier point, I actually also considered the CCST, that inaugural year of CCST. But I felt that I wasn't, if I was going to do a legislative fellowship, I wanted to be in Washington. I had lived in Washington, D.C. prior to grad school and really liked the city. So that's my story. I applied, and this process has changed a little bit since I applied, but I applied to the 2 tracks. The legislative track to work in the United States Congress and the executive branch track, and was offered fellowships in both, but I went with the legislative experience. And so I transitioned from being a postdoc in neuroscience at UC Berkeley to working on Capitol Hill in the House of Representatives for a member of Congress from New Jersey. And from that point forward, had an experience very, very similar to Sam's. Happy to talk more about some of those details, and also to share my experience. Even though I did the fellowship quite a long time ago, relative to others in the meeting, I have subsequently served as chair of the selection committee for the AAAS Congressional Fellowship. So happy to sort of talk about what it looks like on the other side of receiving those applications.
Excellent. Thank you. I will pass this back to Angela.
Sure, thank you. Just a quick question. Libby, did you did you got the AAAS fellowship through like applying at the AAAS website directly, or from other channels? I think that's something that participants will want to know.
So it's a good question. So the way the AAAS organizes the congressional fellowship, they offer the AAAS itself offers 1 or 2 placements every year. And then it has partnerships with other scientific and professional societies. So for example, just throwing examples out here, the American Mathematical Society will sponsor a fellowship working with AAAS. So if you're interested in the legislative experience, it relative to the federal agency executive branch experience, it behooves you to look at your home professional, scientific or professional society to see if they offer a fellowship. And to Joanne's earlier comments, the AAAS fellowship website is actually really, really well done. It has a lot of resources on it, and it lists all of these different partner societies. It also lists other fellowships like CCST and others that folks might be interested in. So sorry, and to answer your question, I applied through AAAS for the executive branch, and then the Society for Research and Child Development for the congressional or legislative branch. And that's because my graduate work and my postdoctoral work was looking at brain development.
And on that point, for the congressional fellowships through the societies, the requirements can be slightly different from AAAS's. So you do have to look on a per society basis for what those requirements are. It's requirements such as, do you need PhD in hand or not when you do the application? And then the application material itself also varies a little bit across them.
Yeah, but then once those fellows come in, everyone is treated the same, with some differences. Oh.
I think we had a Zoom blunder.
I was trying to because I was trying to apply. I was looking for all these fellowship starting from 2-3 years ago, and then when I look at AAAS fellowship, I realized it took me some time to understand that there are other channels that you can apply AAAS with, and different channels, different scientific organizations. They have different eligibility criteria.
Yeah. And actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was sort of characterizing it as it's the legislative congressional track where you want to look to the partner societies. But some partner societies, the American Psychological Association comes to mind, also place fellows in the executive branch in partnership with AAAS. So really the best advice is to go to the AAAS website and then also look internally, both to your sort of home professional society and then any ones that might be related. And if you're talking about a grad student membership, they're often reasonably affordable if you need to, become a member in order to apply through that society.
Thank you, Libby and Justin. So moving on to our questions section, the first question I want to ask for all the panelists is, what made you decide that you want or not want a career in science policy? Can I start with Libby?
Sure. So I had pretty much made up my mind when I applied for the AAAS fellowship that I was going to use it as a stepping stone to sort of transition my career into science policy. It was a little bit of a gamble in the sense of, would I like it? Would I want to stay in Washington? Would I want to work in policy? But I was pretty confident that I would. Sort of my experiences in the application process, my experiences in the interview process, all really just resonated, with what I was passionate about. And again, it was sort of what I alluded to before. I began to think about, what did I really want out of my career? And here I am, sort of 13 years later, having stayed in DC this whole time. And fundamentally, what I view myself as most passionate about, and why I wanted to stay in policy and why I continue to work in it, is to really serve as this sort of person who can speak the language of science and scientists and academics and also someone who can speak the language of senators and representatives and federal agency leadership, and to really be a liaison between those two groups. There are real cultural differences between those groups, and I think people who have those skills are desperately needed to kind of do that crosswalk. One thing I hope we talk about too is some of the nuances, I think, between my experience and Justin's experience, in the sense that when I got to the United States House of Representatives, I used zero knowledge related to cognitive neuroscience. In some cases, negative knowledge. I mean, it was a completely different thing. And some AAAS fellows, and Justin can correct me if I just read your bio, actually get to do work that's much more closely aligned with their scientific expertise. So that's also something to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, I mean, that
Go ahead.
go ahead next. That's a pretty good segue. So yeah, I mean, I applied, and as I said, kind of in my story, right? I mean, I tried to pivot my entire graduate student journey towards going into science policy, and had all intentions to have a long, fruitful career in science policy. And now, based off my job title, you could probably guess that I am not in science policy. So I kind of developed a dual interest near the end of my PhD and kind of in my postdoc in also doing data science and machine learning, as this was starting to get, really big around, 2016, 2017. So I actually had this kind of crisis of paths where, do I do science policy, this thing I've been angling for years, or do I go into data science, which also seems really cool, might give me more flexibility on where I live and things like that. And so I, figured I'd apply to AAAS because I pivoted the past 4 years to do that. And then, and this was executive branch, and the way that fellowship works is you go through all this application process. They accept you, and then they say, okay, come out to DC, and you have 1 week where you're going to interview with a bunch of different agencies, and they send you this file with all these PDF job descriptions for every open placement, and there were about 200 of them. And so obviously you can't apply for all of them, but you gotta read through them. And I'm reading through them, and lo and behold, there's a few of them that are data science. And so I realized that I could both be a science policy fellow and pursue this path of data science that I was interested in. So it gave me more time to figure out, which direction do I want to take my life in. And that's one of the beauties of the executive branch fellows. There is no kind of one typical fellow, right? If you have 200 different job descriptions, some of them have, similarities to each other, but kind of in bulk, they're all very different. You're doing very different work. Some things it's like Libby's saying, you're not going to use any of your scientific expertise. You'll use, of course, the kind of the cognitive skills you've developed, but no one cares how much you know about electrons or whatever. Whereas some, are very science relevant, especially if you're doing something like I was doing in a statistical agency where I was actually, writing code, building models. It wasn't physics, but it was certainly using, knowledge and skills I developed in grad school and in my postdoc. So all that to say, I wanted to go into science policy to make an impact. I also wanted to go into data science to make an impact. And the only reason I left science policy was mostly because I wanted to come back to California, where my girlfriend, now wife, was, and I wanted that flexibility. And certainly at the time, the government wasn't as remote friendly as it now was. So I left government, but it certainly was not an indictment on my time in science policy or in the government.
To follow up on that, using California as a transition, I was at UC Irvine. I really enjoyed living in California. And so CCST always had kind of an incumbency advantage for me. Easy move, place I was really enjoying. But thinking back to even when I started grad school, I was very intent on being a scientist, but there was also a lot of stuff happening, particularly on a national level. This was 2016 through 2018. I was seeing a lot of stuff happen that I didn't agree with and felt pretty helpless amid a very politically fraught country. And so I was surveying a bunch of tide pools and doing my seaweed research and really enjoying that. But I had a really hard time making an argument that that was really going to change anybody's life. I remember publishing my first paper and being honestly kind of underwhelmed and wondering if anybody was ever going to read it, and kind of that existential grad school dread. And so I was definitely looking for something that would potentially have a bigger, more direct impact. And so that's what really got me into policy. And that's very much been paid off. We'll see what the governor signs, but there are bills that have come out of our committee, in my opinion, noticeably better than they came in. And it's felt really good to have kind of a more direct impact. As far as some of the other things that have been brought up around this question, it's interesting even just looking across my fellowship class. So I studied seaweeds and now do energy policy with very, very little overlap. And so many of the kind of more ephemeral skills, like looking at a complex ecosystem, was really, really helpful for me getting into energy policy and seeing how these different agencies interact, how they collaboratively regulate different sectors, how different emerging technologies in energy can disrupt others, and how, in the same way, like a new species being introduced to an ecosystem might shake things up, that a new kind of solar panel might open up new energy opportunities. So I would say a lot of the skills, particularly around communication, which has been mentioned, are incredibly important. And the more of that kind of exposure you can get in grad school, if there's any opportunity to take a science communication class, that was something that was very helpful for me. So I didn't use my research field-specific knowledge much in my policy fellowship, but also there's a current fellow who works at, or was placed at the Department of Pesticide Regulation and did all of her graduate work in pesticides and the effects of pesticides on ecosystems and particularly rodents. So that was one that was much, much more kind of directly applicable. And we are in part of the fellowship year where a lot of my friends are looking for jobs. We're evaluating kind of what we want to do next. I've really enjoyed working in the legislature and really want to keep working here. So I'm looking at legislative offices and really want to keep working on bills. But some of my friends in my class kind of miss some of the academic lifestyle, academic perspective, kind of the workflow of academia, where you'll work on a project for a couple months or a couple years. A lot of these folks got placed in agencies where instead of working kind of rapid fire on legislation, they might be implementing a really big, say, like air quality regulation for months and months and months, and working out how to implement like a really big bill. And so a lot of the agency work kind of feels a little bit more reminiscent of academia. But as I think tried to bring up in my opening slides, plenty of CCST fellows go back to working at national labs and kind of pivot kind of back to kind of an applied science where they're doing kind of policy relevant work, but also very much staying in like kind of research and development and kind of getting to blend those two. So I think a lot of fellows coming out of CCST kind of look at that spectrum of science to policy and honestly have a lot of options as far as where they want to land.
Thank you, Sam. Actually, I'm going to start with you for the following two questions. So what does your day-to-day work schedule look like when you are on your science policy fellowship? And is there any tips for applying these fellowships for you at CCST?
Sure thing. Well, I'll give you the big ecologist question, or ecologist answer, I guess, which is that it varies. It varies tremendously. So in the fellowship placement process, which we do at the end of that kind of 1 month initial boot camp, you find out a lot about the different offices you can work in. Some are more kind of hybrid friendly. I personally wanted to be somewhere where I could be in person. I was just coming out of essentially 3 years of pandemic grad school of like talking to my advisor mostly on Slack. And so I was excited to be kind of in an office and be able to ask a bunch of questions all the time. So that was something I prioritized. And then a lot of my day-to-day was working on legislation, reading bills, doing background research, writing up analyses on bills. One of the big pivots, I think, between academia and policy, at least at the legislative level, is I was used to just being able to do a bunch of background reading and write something up. Whereas in at least the legislative world, a lot of it is taking meetings with people. So if I need to learn about agrivoltaics, which are solar panels on active agricultural land, instead of reading like 3 50-page PDFs, I would probably read one 50-page PDF and then take meetings with an organization that advocates for co-locating solar and agriculture, and kind of get their perspective on what they thought the subject matter would kind of be or what the bill would do. So a lot of meetings, a little bit of research, yeah, a little bit of writing. Sometimes the writing is honestly tough to get to because you have so many meetings, and a lot of that sometimes gets pushed, especially during the crazier times of the legislative calendar, to the evenings. So there have been a couple late nights where I was writing bill analyses for sure. But one really nice thing about my day-to-day is that there are often very hard deadlines in the legislative calendar. So even if things are totally crazy, I can stay late writing bill analyses. It's like all of these bills are going to be out of our committee by next Wednesday, and then I'm free, as opposed to my feelings of in grad school where I was in like year 3 and I was like, can I keep this up for another 2 years? Can I? I don't really know. Depends on the day. So that's a little bit about the day-to-day. And the other question was about the application process, kind of tips for applying.
Yeah, tips for applying fellowship. I think you covered a little bit in your slide.
Well, so in talking to the people who review the applications, I think one thing that really comes out is that they really want to see people make their case for why they want to do it. And this is something we covered really at the outset. Like, so you were just in grad school for say like 5 or 6 years to be a science person. So why do you want to kind of pivot and be like kind of a science person, but also kind of a policy person? Like, what's the reason you can give? How do you narrativize? Like, did something happen in your life, or you saw something happen, or you're just very, very interested in policy, or want to have a different impact that you don't feel like your research is having in academia. But I think it's really, really important to be honest with yourself and figure out why you really want to do this, and then be able to tell a story about that and communicate why you want to make what in a lot of ways, like rationally looking, is not always like a neat career pivot. Like there are a lot of things that you'll need to learn. There are a lot of changes that will need to be made. You might have to move, and kind of justifying why you really want to do that, I think, is really important in the application process. The other thing that comes up a lot is I think everybody in grad school has like 100 skills that they just don't think of as skills. But so many things, like I did a bunch of teaching, and it's not by choice. It was because I didn't have funding and I was just TAing all the time. But that was some of the best experience in terms of being able to break down complex concepts. I've done a lot of briefings on different energy bills this year, where my teaching experience has been incredibly helpful with kind of breaking down a really complex, like 8-part piece of legislation into something that's a little bit more manageable, in the same way that I remember teaching about like different organelles in a cell. And so I think it's really helpful to like look through the things you do in your day-to-day as a grad student and break those down to the skills that you have to do those things. And then say, if you're in an interview for a fellowship, say like, I've done a lot of teaching, I have that experience. I think that experience will be really, really helpful in communicating with legislatures. Or I published two papers for my dissertation, say, and that'll be really helpful in being able to write clearly and communicate through writing. And those papers really broke down really complex concepts. So I would say that everybody in this room has more skills than they think they do. And I think it's really important to be able to kind of inventory your own skills and be able to apply those as directly as possible to how they would be useful in a policy environment.
Thank you. Justin and Libby.
I'll go first, since I think Libby's going to have the better answer given her experiences. So just real quickly on the day-to-day, it's the same answer as Sam, and that there is no day-to-day. I mean, there is maybe a day-to-day within a specific office or a specific role in the executive branch, but kind of across all of them, it's going to vary so much, right? So I was in the Census Bureau, and it kind of looked more or less like corporate America, right? I went into my cubicle, I did my work, I had some meetings, did some various other things, but otherwise it's not appreciably different than industry. Whereas, of course, if you're in, Congress, it's going to look very different. And if you're in other agencies, executive agencies, where you're dealing with a lot of stakeholders, you're going to have more of a kind of a meeting driven day than a work at your computer head down driven day. So it really just depends on placement. And if you do become an executive branch fellow, that's one of the things you'd ask during your interview week interviews, just like, what does it look like if I'm working in this office? Because it just varies so much. And then for, kind of tips on the application, it's, Sam really nailed it with that, right? You need to make a case for why you're doing this thing, because they don't want people who are just kind of panic applying, that like they don't know what they're going to want to do with their life. Let's just try this, right? They want that case study. That said, I do know one person who applied on a whim and got it, but he was able to look back and kind of investigate his own path and see, like, even though he wasn't angling for science policy, clearly there were pieces that kind of paved that way. So again, like, if you really look at what you're doing beyond just I'm a scientist, you can break it down and see, there's, you're not just a scientist, you might also be a communicator, depending on your role in your lab, you might even be a kind of a manager, right? All these different things. You might be a mentor if you have undergrads or younger grad students, etc. And then I had one more piece of advice, and where did it go? Another, I think I actually cheated and looked ahead on Angela's questions, but I think it's relevant here. Do scientific publications matter? No, but yes, right? Like, they don't want someone who's a complete failure dropout as a scientist, but like, you don't need to be the best scientist in your lab or anything, right? So, maybe a publication helps, but you don't need, you're not applying for a faculty job. You're not even applying for a competitive postdoc. You don't need, 100 publications. But some quality science doesn't hurt.
Sure. So I think for me, having been a fellow in the legislative, in the United States Congress, very similar to Sam in a lot of ways. California is, and I say this with a lot of love for California, is essentially its own country in many ways. And so the California state legislature, right, is a huge, it functions very similar to the United States Congress. So a lot of similarities there. I think I will just draw one or two areas of difference. So based on, and I'm just meeting Sam today, so please forgive me if I've mischaracterized, but based on Sam's description of his work, he's working on a committee. He's actually engaged in pretty technical work for that committee. Committees tend to be more technically focused. In contrast, when I was in the United States House of Representatives, I worked for a member of Congress from New Jersey. So I did two things that I think probably Sam maybe does less of. Number one is I worked directly with my boss's constituents who were in his district in New Jersey, who lived there, who voted for him, who expected him to help them with, getting Social Security benefits, and why is my post office closed early on Tuesdays, and all kinds of really basic things that have nothing to do with science, but are really about the representative way that the House of Representatives is meant to sort of represent the people in the United States, the residents of the United States. So there was that piece of it, that constituent services piece. And then the other thing that I feel that I spent a lot of time on really is politics, just sort of naked politics, the like, in the trenches, fighting Dems versus Republicans, because that is just, unfortunately, and it's even worse than now than it was 13 years ago. That's really just the nature of especially the United States House of Representatives, which is a majority rules body, and is highly reflective of the extreme partisanship that we see in the United States right now. And so those are just two additional things to keep in mind. So if you're interested in the AAAS fellowship and you're interested in a congressional thing, you should be interested in politics. Scientists and politicians are very, very different breeds. Happy to talk more about that. But there is an aspect, especially working on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, where you really need to at least be interested in politics and care about that in a way that's different than someone who goes and works at the National Institutes of Health as a fellow, or the National Science Foundation, or the USDA, or whatever it might be, where you're much more insulated from some of that stuff. And then what I loved about the day-to-day was just getting to work on a million different things and having a really, really broad portfolio. So I had a PhD in neuroscience, and I worked on issues ranging from disability policy, which was kind of relevant, early childhood education, definitely relevant, energy policy, environmental policy, and then my personal favorite, postal service issues, which has absolutely nothing to do with having a PhD in neuroscience. So huge range of issues. I learned a ton. Really learned how the government, how Congress works. And that has actually helped me in every single job I've held in Washington, D.C. since then. So that was really the huge benefit for me. I will just mention on application advice. And this is a difference, and I'll just be really frank. I mean, when I was applying to the AAAS fellowship in 2009, science policy, I mean, obviously it was a thing and it existed, but it has completely blown up. And so in 2009, nobody had done things like you all are doing here, because that didn't exist. And so there was no competitive advantage to be gained from
Hello,
having.
madam. Hello.
This keeps happening to me when I'm talking. So there was sort of no competitive advantage to be gained from that, because there was sort of those opportunities didn't exist, right? And so for me, what I would encourage folks is to remember that, yes, it's absolutely important for AAAS to demonstrate that you're passionate about science and society, that you have a skill set beyond the lab, you're good at science communication, you've done outreach, you've volunteered on a Hill Day, you've done different things. But ultimately to remember that it's meant to be a fellowship where you learn skills, and you don't have to have a master's degree in political science. And frankly, if you do, you probably don't need the AAAS fellowship, right? You could probably get some of those policy jobs in the federal government sort of on your own credentials and on your own skill set that you already have. And then the other thing I'll say, and again, this is not something that happened in 2009 and 2010. Nobody applied to the AAAS fellowship as their backup position for the faculty job search, but that does happen now. And I can tell when I read the application that that's the case, and those immediately get to the bottom of the pile. So really only apply if you're truly passionate about learning more about science policy.
Thank you, Libby. I saw someone just raise his hand. We'll address the questions later in the breakout room. If that's okay for everyone. Last question before we put everyone in the breakout room, so you can freely ask whatever question you want for the panelists. This question is about what advice and resources would you give to people, for example, graduate students and above, undergraduate students and international. I saw similar questions in our chat as well. Who are interested in a similar career but don't know where to start? Like, what advice and resources for you to give to these different group of people?
So I could take. Oh, sorry, Justin.
Oh, go ahead.
You go ahead.
Okay, sure. So, I was referencing earlier, the AAAS's fellowship website has a database of other fellowships, and one of the ways in which you can search through that database is citizenship requirements. So definitely look there first. There are a number of fellowships that don't require U.S. citizenship out there. Another area, two other things that are sort of related. So, I believe everyone that's participating today is currently affiliated with an institution of higher education. Nearly all universities have offices of federal relations. This is kind of my day job now at Lewis Burke. Nearly all universities have offices of federal relations. And nearly all of those offices are desperate for people who want to come in and help with their workload. And you get to learn a little bit about what science policy looks like for a university. That's a range of things. That's research funding, that's tech transfer and IP, that's name, image, and likeness policies as it relates to student athletics, et cetera. So it's just a way to kind of get some exposure there. And those people are already inside your university, and it's certainly very easy to set up an informational coffee or lunch with those people. And then relatedly, again, going back to this idea of your scientific and professional societies, you're a member of that organization. Almost all of them have some sort of policy platform, interest, office, etc. Many of the bigger ones across all disciplines are desperate for their members to participate in Capitol Hill advocacy days. And you get to do that if you're a member of the society. There's no sort of citizenship involvement, anything like that. So encourage you all to think about those two avenues.
Yeah, those are great. And to add, I mean, other things you could do things like, write a letter to the editor at your, hometown newspaper. You can do Hill Day visits. They're often, they can be organized by your scientific society, or in the case of UC Irvine, they used to organize visits to Sacramento to do some lobbying. I imagine other universities and other groups do similar things, right? So all those kind of help show that track record of interest in science and science policy issues. And then also, plug for things like, Journal of Science Policy and Governance, getting involved there if you can, becoming an associate editor. Sam, I believe I heard in the intro that Sam did that. I also had done it in grad school. So, something like that's worth looking into, opportunities through the National Science Policy Network, so on and so forth. As kind of, Libby alluded, this has really exploded over the past few years. There's a huge interest and huge amount of groups and a huge amount of opportunities. So just kind of looking through all those resources and pursuing those.
I would second Justin's recommendation of the NSPN. That was really how I started to kind of accelerate my interest in science policy. It was something that I was vaguely familiar with, but didn't really know what was out there or even where to look. And so I remember, it's probably one of the most impactful parts of my career, but just getting an invite to the NSPN Slack channel where people were just posting resources all the time and posting like, here's a Google Doc of like the 8 fellowships I applied to last year. And it was just like, what are all these things? So I think any way you can kind of meet people with similar interests and kind of get in that conversation, there's just so much that you absorb. Your school has a science policy group. A lot of them like don't have a full executive board. I think a lot of the most powerful things you have is your time and your availability and your bandwidth. And I mean, being an associate editor at JSPG, the Science Policy Journal, took time, but was also an incredible opportunity to kind of deep dive a couple of different policy fields, and that was super helpful when I was interviewing for CCST, being able to talk about working on different policy issues. So think about things that might be good experience that might be relevant down the road. One specific thing I want to mention for people still in college is that there's a couple different fellowship programs in California, up in Sacramento, in both the legislature and the executive agencies that don't require a PhD. Like the Science Fellow program is unique in that way, but there are programs in the Assembly Fellows, the Senate Fellows, and the Executive Branch Fellows. They were just honored on the floor of the state legislature yesterday. They all got these filed plaques, and a lot of them were fresh out of college. And I look back at that and I'm like, I'm so impressed. I remember what I was like to be around when I was 22 or 23. And so I've been pretty blown away by the fellows in those programs. But those are something that's available really as soon as you graduate. So I don't know how many undergrads we have in the group, but if this is something you're interested in, that could be a good place to look.
Thank you, Sam. So I think we still have about 15 minutes right now, and I'm going to put everyone into breakout rooms. So we'll have 3 breakout rooms, each breakout room for 1 panelist. I want to drop a link for everyone. This is a really useful link compiled by National Science Policy Network. You don't have to be a member in order to access the link, but if you click on the link, you see a full list of science policy fellowships, science advocacy fellowships, science diplomacy fellowship, and all the other kind of related resources for folks are interested in policy, advocacy, and diplomacy. But I also encourage you to join NSPN because it's not too much for students and early career scientists. If you're an undergraduate student, I think it's $10 per year. If you're a graduate student, or early career scientist is $20 per year. And once you join the NSPN, you have a lot of funding opportunities. So before I hand it to Joanne for closing, I want to ask every panelist, do you have any last word to share? I know Libby said someone was asking you a question right when the breakout room come back. How about we start with Justin, because you're on mute right now.
Yeah, I think my last words would just be, and this kind of encapsulates some of the questions I was asked, is there's no one route to being in science policy, and there's not one kind of cookie cutter science policy career, right? You don't need to go straight in after grad school. You can spend a few years doing something else, and there's a million things you can be doing in science policy, and it can lead you to more things in science policy or more things out of science policy, right? It's a myriad of things, and I think that's an important thing to embrace.
Thank you. Sam, can I call on you?
Sure. I got a question about work-life balance in my room, which was really helpful, for me to kind of process an inventory of the year. But that really made me think about the importance of kind of knowing what you're looking for. Like if you had a really unwork-life balance grad school experience and you're looking for something that's really explicitly a 9 to 5, where you will never be asked to work on a Sunday, say that. Like, it's okay to say, I'm coming out of a crazy time in my life. I would really like to have something that I care about, but I do want to have boundaries. Like, I do want to have time for family. I do want to be able to travel or take vacation. I think that's something that I was maybe a little bit shy about saying, but it's okay to draw those lines. And that's really important for figuring out what might be a really good fit for you. Like, if you never want to work late nights, the legislature might not be great, but you might be excellent in an agency, either federal or in California or another state. So I would say try to figure out what kind of where you might want to land, maybe kind of day to day, maybe in subject area, whether you want to stick with what you've been, say, researching in grad school, like my friend who worked on pesticides and now works on pesticide policy, or maybe you want to use it to make a big pivot where, say, you liked your research, but you never want to look at another seaweed again. Maybe you start doing energy, and that's a really, really effective way to kind of move your career forward. So I would say, think about what you want to get out of it and be honest with yourself about that. And then it's okay to say kind of where you want to go and what you want to do.
So I see that it looks like it was Gabrielle was asking me a question. So let me answer that question. It's in the chat, and then I'll just kind of make my final comment. So yeah, good question. I actually don't know the answer to this because the prior AAAS fellows that have participated in the application review process, meaning that have been either readers or on selection committees, is not sort of something that's kind of publicly available in any easy way. A couple things come to mind. The first is both Justin and I talked about the value of attending the AAAS conference itself. There's tons of networking opportunities there. You're bound to meet someone at one of those networking opportunities, receptions, et cetera, that has done this. I don't want to speak out of turn, but My recollection is that the grad student rate is not, attendance registration fee is not huge. So that's something to consider. And then just using LinkedIn to find AAAS fellows, looking for current or former fellows from any university that you've been affiliated with, whether as a grad student, undergrad, postdoc, etc. I guess in terms of my kind of final thoughts, so I really like what Justin and Sam had said. I mean, I would say for me, probably the most important thing is try to be open to new experiences, and sort of be willing to take a little bit of a leap to try something new. The member of Congress that I worked for was himself a scientist. And he always would use this quote, which was from Louis Pasteur, but I think was not exactly accurate, but the point stands, which is that this idea that chance favors the prepared mind. And so you want to know what you're interested in, you want to do that self-reflection, you want to have your ideas, but at the same time, you may go for an informational coffee and learn about a career pathway that you had not at all considered. And if you're really interested in it and it feels right, it's worth exploring. And I know that the idea of doing what feels right sometimes is antithetical to being a scientist who has had scientific training, but it's something that I think is important to think about.
Thank you, Libby. And thank you, Sam. Thank you, Justin. Especially Sam, I like someone's doing something in your background. But let me pass this to Joanne.
All I have to say is everyone, please just drop a big thank you, hand claps in chat for our panelists. Thank you, Angela, for moderating us today. So incredibly thankful for you all and your experiences and your